Volume 2, Chapter 14 of The Widow Barnaby by Frances Milton Trollope. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14. A Cheltenham Ball, an Introduction, a Conquest. A great deal of profound meditation was bestowed by Mrs. Barnaby on the occurrences of that morning before the time arrived for the toilette, preparatory to the ball of the succeeding night. All these will show themselves in their results as they arise; and for the present it will be only necessary to mention that, in providing for this toilette, everything approaching to the sordid cares dictated by economy was banished. The time was too short to admit of her ordering a new dress for this occasion, though the powerful feeling at work within her caused a white satin, decorated in every possible way with the richest blonde, to be bespoken for the next. Every other article that Cheltenham could furnish, and it being the height of the season, Paris itself could hardly do more for her. Every other species of expensive decoration, short of diamonds and pearls, was purchased for this important ball, at which something within her, speaking with the authority of an oracle, declared that she should become acquainted with Lord Mucklebury. Busy as were the afternoon and morning which intervened, she found time for the very necessary business of ordering her broker (he had been her father's broker) to sell out £500 stock for her, and this done, and her letter safely deposited in the boarding-house letter-bag, she turned her thoughts towards Agnes. She had certainly, to use her own language when reasoning the point with herself, the very greatest mind in the world not to take her to the ball at all. But this mind, great as it was not a settled mind, and was presently shaken by a sort of instinctive consciousness that there was in Agnes, independent of her beauty, a something that might help to give consequence to her entrée. As to her dress, thought she, I am perfectly determined that it shall be the same she wore at Clifton, not so much on account of the expense; at the present moment it would be madness to permit such a consideration to have any effect; but because it gives her an air more distinguished, more remarkable than any one else. And besides, who knows but that the contrast of style, beautiful as she is, may be favourable to me? I have not forgotten our fellow traveller from Silverton, she seemed to freeze him; and let her freeze my adorable Viscount too, so that But here her thoughts came too rapidly to dress themselves in words, and for a few minutes her reverie was rather a tumult than a meditation. Yes, she shall go, she exclaimed at last, rising from the sofa, and collecting a variety of precious parcels, the result of her shopping. Yes, she shall go to the ball, and should any mischief be likely to follow, I will make her go out to service before the end of the week. Having thus at last come to a determination, and upon reasonings which she felt were not likely to be shaken, she mounted to her sleeping apartment, and after indulging herself by spreading forth various articles of newly purchased finery upon the bed, she turned to the corner in which Agnes, her tiny table, her books, and writing apparatus were all packed away together in the smallest possible space, and said, " Come here, Agnes, you must have done lessons enough for to day, and I have great news for you. Where do you think I mean to take you to night?" Agnes cast her eyes upon the bed, and immediately anticipating some public display of which she was doomed to be a witness, replied in a tone that was anything but joyful, " I don't know, aunt." " I don't know, aunt," retorted Mrs. Barnaby, indignantly mimicking her tone. " What an owl of a girl you are, Agnes ! Oh, how unlike what I was at the same age, you don't know. I suppose you don't, indeed. There is not another woman under the sun besides myself who would do for a dependent, penniless girl all I am doing for you. I sacrifice everything for you, my feelings, my health, my money, and yet you look exactly as if I was going to take you to school again instead of a ball." Agnes sighed. She thought of her last ball, of all its pains and all its pleasures, and feeling but too sure that it was as impossible she should escape the former, as improbable that she should find the latter, she replied mournfully enough, " I would rather not go, if you please, aunt. I do not like balls." " Upon my honour, Agnes, if I had not a temper that was proof against everything, I should be tempted to box your ears. Is it possible to see anything more disgustingly hypocritical than a girl of 17 screwing herself up and saying, ' I do not like balls '? I wonder what you do like, Miss Prim? But I promise you, I do not intend to ask your leave for what I do, and as long as you eat my bread you will do as I bid you, or else turn out and provide for yourself at once. Let me hear no more such stuff, if you please. But take care to make yourself decent, and be ready to get into the carriage exactly at 9 o'clock. Do you hear?" Agnes meekly turned to her travelling magazine of sable suits, and was considerably surprised by being told that she must instantly get ready to go out for the purpose of buying satin shoes, white gloves, and one or two other trifles, which the newly enlarged views of her aunt now rendered necessary. All this was done. Miss Morrison engaged to join their party, the labours of the hairdresser were completed, and a toilette of 2 hours' duration was brought to a most satisfactory conclusion within 10 minutes of the early hour she had named, and to the ball room they repaired considerably before any other person entered it. " I told you it would be so, my dear Mrs. Barnaby," said Miss Morrison, looking rather disconsolately round her. " Nous sommes trop tôt. But never mind, let us sit down comfortably on this sofa, and I dare say I shall be able to tell you the names of most of the principal people. Cheltenham is so very delightful, that almost everybody comes over and over again. C'est tout à fait la mode." A few straggling strangers began to enter almost immediately, and in about half an hour the well pleased Miss Morrison was enabled to redeem her promise by pointing out some scores of well dressed individuals by name. But still Lord Mucklebury came not, and the widow's heart grew sad, till happily she heard a young partnerless lady say as she swept by, " What a bore it is that all the best men come so late." In a moment hope was rekindled in Mrs. Barnaby's eye, and with renewed interest she listened to the catalogue of names which her friend poured into her ear. " Oh, here comes the bride, Lady Stephenson. What a handsome man her husband is! I have seen her here often with her aunt Lady Elizabeth Norris, before she was married. The old lady dotes upon Cheltenham, they say. I wish you knew some more people ; but, name port, it will all come by and by, I dare say, and I will introduce you to Lady Elizabeth if I can. But I must ask her first, or she may take miff. Elle hay ung piu fear." " Stephenson ?" said Mrs. Barnaby. " Is it Sir Edward Stephenson?" " Yes, Sir Edward, that's his name. Do you know him, Mrs. Barnaby? We were most intimately acquainted with his brother at Clifton, and with Colonel Hubert too. That's her brother, you know. Pray, is he here too?" How Agnes trembled as she waited for the answer. " I don't know. I have not seen him yet," replied Miss Morrison, " and it is impossible to overlook him. C'est un homme superbe. But comme il est fier. Perhaps he will come in presently. He is always un peu tard at the balls, for he never dances." " Oh, I know that," said Mrs. Barnaby. " I know him perfectly well, I assure you. He is a most elegant person ; but I suspect he is rather of a violent and jealous temper. However, I'm sure I wish he was here, and his friend Frederick Stephenson too. He's a charming young man, and used to walk to Bristol with us, and dance 3 times a night with Agnes." " Dear me, you don't say so !" exclaimed Miss Morrison, to whom the intelligence was extremely agreeable, as it removed at once all doubts and fears respecting Mrs. Barnaby's real station in society. " Well, then, I'm sure you ought to know Lady Elizabeth Norris ; and I really must somehow or other contrive to let her hear of your acquaintance with her nephew, Colonel Hubert. They say she dotes upon him, and that he is to be her heir, and that's almost a pity, for he has a noble fortune of his own already. Do you happen to know how much his sister had, Mrs. Barnaby? Some say 20, some 30, some 50,000. " Young Stephenson never happened to say anything about it that I recollect," replied the widow. " But look ! Lady Elizabeth is coming this way. You had better step forward, Miss Morrison, that she may see you." But there was no occasion for any contrivance on the part of Miss Morrison in order to obtain the notice of Lady Elizabeth ; for that lady having descried and recognised the party, she immediately decided that Miss Morrison, whose acquaintance she had cultivated for several successive seasons, on account of her admirable French, should be for her the medium of introduction to the pompous widow, who was clever enough to make her niece drink the waters instead of herself. It was therefore by a straight and direct line that, supported by the arm of Sir Edward Stephenson, and followed by his lady, she crossed the room from her own place to that occupied by those whom, in her own particular manner, she delighted to honour. Miss Morrison's surprise was as great as her satisfaction when she perceived this to be the case ; and she felt her triumph doubled by her fine new acquaintance being the witness of it. " Bonjour, Miss Morrison," said the old lady, holding out her hand. " Toujours en bonne sante, j'espere?" Amidst smiles and bows, and blushes and courtesies, Miss Morrison replied in her favourite jargon, " Mais oui, milady. and I hope your ladyship is the same." "A good many old faces here, Miss Morrison, and a good many new ones, too. You have friends with whom I do not remember to have seen before. You must introduce me." This request threw the good-natured spinster into a twitter of delight which almost deprived her of the power of obeying it. First she made a little movement with one hand, and then with the other; while the ample Mrs. Barnaby stood in happy smiling expectation, and the tall, stiff-looking old lady continued gazing at the group through her half-closed eyes, and determined on no account to hasten a process from which she derived so great amusement. At length the respective names were pronounced in their proper order, that of the blushing Agnes being included. The old lady gave her a look in which something of surprise was mingled with curiosity, and suddenly turning round to Lady Stephenson, who stood behind her, she said, " Come, Emily, you must be introduced too. Miss Willoughby, Lady Stephenson." Mrs. Barnaby had prepared another smile and another majestic bend for the presentation of herself to the fair bride, but it did not follow; a disappointment for which she was soon consoled by Lady Elizabeth's sitting down, and graciously intimating by an action of her hand that the widow might sit beside her. Agnes meanwhile stood trembling from head to foot, with her eyes timidly fixed on the beautiful countenance of Colonel Hubert's sister. As it was quite impossible her ladyship could understand the cause of the agitation she inspired, so neither was she at all aware of its strength. But she saw that the beautiful girl before her, notwithstanding the quiet, unstudied grace of her appearance, was not at her ease, and could only account for it by supposing that she was suffering from extreme shyness. Lady Stephenson had not yet forgotten the time when she, too, had hardly dared to look up unless her paternal brother, as she was wont to call him, stood very near to sustain her carriage, and, sympathizing with a weakness that was in some degree constitutional in herself, she felt disposed to take more notice of the fair stranger than she usually bestowed upon persons introduced to her by the whimsical caprices of her aunt. Lady Stephenson was, however, altogether mistaken. Agnes was not at that moment suffering from shyness. There was timidity, certainly, in the pleasure with which she listened to the voice and gazed at the features of Colonel Hubert's sister ; but still it was pleasure, and very nearly the most lively she had ever experienced. " You are at Cheltenham for the first time, Miss Willoughby? " said the bride. " Yes," replied Agnes ;" we only arrived 2 days ago." There was not much opportunity of indicating a feeling of any kind by these words ; nevertheless, the manner with which they were spoken, and the sweet expression of the beautiful eyes that were raised to hers, convinced Lady Stephenson that however shy her new acquaintance might be, she greatly liked to be spoken to, and accordingly continued the conversation, which, to her own surprise, warmed so much as it proceeded, that at length her aunt being evidently settled down for an elaborate development of the absurdities, whatever they might be, of her new acquaintance, she offered her arm, inviting her to take a turn round the room. Could this be real? Was it possible that she was walking round the Cheltenham ballroom on the arm of Colonel Hubert's sister? But though the happy Agnes asked herself this question again and again, neither the asking nor the answering it prevented her bearing her part in a conversation that made her so exquisitely happy with all the pretty earnestness of one interested in every word that was said to her, and too young and fresh minded to conceal the pleasure she felt. Lady Stephenson was unexpectedly pleased with her young companion. There was no mixture of niaiserie in the simplicity of Agnes ; and though her ladyship in no degree shared her aunt's extravagant passion for originals, she had in her own quiet way a reasonably strong liking for whatever appeared to her untainted by affectation. The beauty of Agnes might perhaps have had some share in the pleasure she gave ; but certain it is that, after taking 2 or 3 turns together instead of one, and perceiving Lady Elizabeth about to move her quarters in search of fresh amusement, she shook hands with Agnes before parting with her so cordially, that she felt called upon to offer some reason for it to her husband, who had quitted her during her promenade, but was now returned. " That is by far the most enchanting girl, Edward, in person, mind, and manners, that I ever remember to have met with. How very strange that she should belong to one of my aunt's collection." " She is vastly beautiful, Emily," replied Sir Edward, " and I suspect that covers a multitude of sins in your eyes, for I observe you never fail to pick out the beauties, go where you will. I declare I think your eyes are infinitely sharper than mine in this way. Having once found out the fairest of the fair, I do not feel so much interest as I used to do in looking about me." " A very pretty speech, Sir Edward," returned the lady, laughing. But that sweet girl's beauty is not her greatest fascination. I must ask Lady Elizabeth whether she found the magnificent lady to whom she has been devoting herself answer her expectations." When this question was put to the old lady, however, she bluntly answered, " No, not at all. She is as dull as a prize ox decorated with ribbons at a fair." " I am sorry to hear it," observed Lady Stephenson, " for I have lost my heart to the fair girl in black whom she seems to lead about as a contrast to her radiant self. I marvel what the connection can be. It is plain they are not related, from the deep mourning of the one and the rainbow brilliance of the other." " Your inference is altogether wrong, my Lady Stephenson. One of this Madame Barnaby's long stories was about this melancholy miss, who is her niece, and who will wear mourning in spite of her. I must watch them at the pump, just to see if the girl makes up for her disobedience in this respect by swallowing the waters, which Pringle says the aunt is determined she shall take, and after that I shall trouble myself no more about them. The great woman does not answer, she is a vulgar, pompous, everyday bore." " Pray do not give her quite up, aunt, for my sake," said Lady Stephenson, " for I have set my fancy upon seeing a great deal more of her niece, who, by the way, for so pertinacious a mourner, is wonderfully sprightly. But I must flatter myself she found consolation in my society. I must beg you to cultivate the acquaintance a little farther." " This is something quite new, Emily," replied the old lady. " It is the first time, I believe, that you ever condescended to take any interest in my menagerie. Far be it from me, my dear, to check so happy a symptom of an improving intellect. I have already asked the expansive widow and her delicate shadow for Wednesday ; and if your fever for cementing a friendship with the latter should happen to continue, yield to it by all means. You know, Emily, I never wish to control anybody's set of favourites, provided always that nobody interferes with my own." The only pleasure which the rest of the evening afforded Agnes arose from studying the features, and still more the countenance of Lady Stephenson, whenever she was fortunate enough to be within sight of her. No one asked her to dance, and no word was uttered within her hearing that gave her the least amusement. One single circumstance cheered the tedious hours during which she was doomed to sit with her aunt Barnaby before her eyes, in a terror which increased every moment lest she should draw the eyes of every one else in the room upon her. This single circumstance was, that the sister of Colonel Hubert, when standing at the 3 feet of distance from her, turned her head and said, with a smile of strong family affinity to his own, " I find that I am to have the pleasure of seeing you on Wednesday at my aunt's, Miss Willoughby. I am very glad of it. Good night." And soon afterwards the party left the room. Far different was the fate of Mrs. Barnaby. The evening began for her very gloriously, for she had been spoken to by a Lady Elizabeth, but it ended in rapture, for before its close Lord Mucklebury made his appearance, stared at her again with the most marked impertinence, inquired and learned her name from Mr. Pringle, by whom he was at his express desire presented, and finally he placed himself beside her on the sofa, where he remained for at least 20 minutes, talking to her in a style that might be said without the slightest exaggeration to have thrown her into a state of temporary delirium. Nor had it failed to produce some emotion in the noble lord. Nay, it is probable it might have lasted longer had it amused him less ; for when he took his leave of the widow, expressing his hope that he should be happy enough to meet her again, he moved with a step rather quicker than ordinary to ensconce himself among a knot of men who were amusing themselves by communicating to each other the most ludicrous remarks on the company in a distant corner of the room. " Have you really torn yourself away from that magnificent specimen of womanhood, Mucklebury ?" said one of the group as he approached them. " She is evidently magnetic by the manner in which you have been revolving round her for some time ; and if magnetic, and the power at all proportioned to the volume, it is a miracle that you ever left her side again." " I never would leave her side again," replied Lord Mucklebury, laughing immoderately, " did I not fear that I should fall at her feet in a fit. Oh, she is glorious." " Who and what is she, in God's name ?" said another. " Who is she ? Barnaby, bless her ! Mistress Barnaby. What is she ? A widow, darling creature ! A widow, fair, fat, and 40, most fat, most fair, and oh ! a pigeon, a dove, a very turtle dove for kindness." " She is really handsome, though, isn't she, Mucklebury ?" said one. " Yes, upon my soul she is," replied the viscount more seriously. and bears looking at too remarkably well, notwithstanding the pot full of coarse rouge that it pleases her to carry about on each of her beautiful cheeks. And by what blessed chance has your lordship been favoured with an introduction? Or did your lordship so far overcome your constitutional timidity as to introduce yourself?" "Alarm not your spirit on that score, Digby," replied Lord Mucklebury. "The medium of introduction was illustrious, but my passion was anterior to it, for the history of our loves was in this wise. It is said of me, I know not how truly, that my taste in beauty tends somewhat towards the Blazabella order. But this as it may, it is certain that yesterday morning, between the hours of 2 and 3, being actively employed for the good of myself and my country in Johnson's sale room, I felt myself penetrated, perforated, pierced, and transfixed by the very bright eyes of this remarkable lady. Whereupon, overpowering my constitutional timidity, Digby, I fixed my regards, eyeglass and all, upon her. But the result was astonishing. Did any of you, gentlemen, ever happen to watch the effect of the sun's rays when thrown upon some soft substance, a pound of butter, for example, through the medium of a burning glass? Such and so great was that produced by the rays of my right eye when sent through my eyeglass upon this charming creature. She warmed, trembled, yea, visibly melted under it. I inquired her name on the spot, but in vain. This evening I have been more successful, and now I have the inexpressible felicity of being enrolled as an acquaintance of this inimitable widow." "A very interesting narrative," said one of his auditors, "and may I ask your lordship what it can be that has now induced you to leave her fair side all unguarded?" "Ecstasy, Tom. I had not strength to witness the emotions I inspired. I tell you, I must have fallen at her feet had I continued near her." The conversation of these merry gentlemen went on for some time longer in the same strain, forming a contrast, perhaps not very uncommon, to the solemn and serious meditations of Mrs. Barnaby on the very same circumstances which caused their mirth. Far, however, from exaggerating the effect he had produced, Lord Mucklebury had little or no idea of its strength and reality. He fancied the lady inflammable, and easily touched by any appearance of admiration; but it never entered his head to suppose that his flourishing speeches and audacious eyes had given birth in her mind to the most sanguine hope, and the most deliberate intention, of becoming Viscountess Mucklebury. Sudden as the formation of these hopes and intentions may appear, it would be doing injustice to Mrs. Barnaby were the reader suffered to believe that they were permitted to take possession of her heedlessly. She remembered Major Allen, she remembered the agony of the moment in which she beheld his friend Maintry appear in the character of a thief; and, sweet to her ears as was the title of her new conquest, she did not suffer to charm away her resolution of discovering whether he were poor or rich. Every inquiry tended to prove that she was safe in the direction which her ambition and her love had now taken. Lord Mucklebury was a widower, with an only son very nobly provided for, and as capable of making a good jointure if he married again as a widow's heart could wish. Now then all that remained to be done was to foster the admiration she had inspired into a passion strong enough to induce the noble Viscount to settle that jointure upon her. Nothing could be more just than her reasoning, nothing more resolute than her purpose. She knew she was handsome, she felt it to be advisable that she should appear rich, and with the devoted feeling of a warrior who throws away his scabbard as he rushes to the onslaught, Mrs. Barnaby heroically set herself to win her way to victory, coûte qui coûte. Chapter 15